Orla, and I was supposed to be getting 12 minutes in this, so Deputy McGrath's party colleague, Deputy Ross, is going to be losing out on this now. But I'll try and leave him a little bit of time. I think the fact that we're even discussing this at all is probably indicative of a general election in the air. It usually goes hand in hand, the catch call up being tough on crime and so on, creating in some ways, I suppose, the illusion of dealing with these issues rather than the reality of dealing with them. The sort of slogans of zero tolerance jump to mind. Now, it goes without saying that those who are the victims of burglary, it can be an absolutely horrific crime linked to violence and so on, even when it isn't. To invade somebody's privacy and personal space is a horrible thing to happen to anybody. But it's not the most horrible thing that can happen to anybody. And there are substantially more serious crimes about which we're not addressing, which I'll deal with in a minute. Now, this bill effectively just deals with the issue of bail for people who are, in essence, prolific burglars. It allows for consecutive sentencing to, in some ways, address the short sentences that are there already, but also allows previous convictions to be taken as evidence in determining whether somebody will be granted bail or not. Nothing too dramatic about either of those provisions, but I do have a question as to why it's been done and being done in this way, because obviously the government has stated that it has an intention to reform the overall bail laws more generally, has submitted a new bill, heads a bill to deal with that in July of this year. But this is only dealing with one aspect of that, so I don't get that. Why are the provisions around bail in this bill not being included in that one? And why is this one being dealt with separately? Because this bill has been moved very quickly from publication to being tabled for debate, even though it was published after the overall bill on bail, which I do think we need to be discussing. And to me, the only answer that you could give to that is it's a stunt. It's a masquerade to hide up and cover for the impact that the closure of rural Garda stations and the cutbacks in resources has had. That's all it is. Even in my own area, you know, chambers of commerce and other businesses and residences are noticing a sharp increase because of the lack of Garda coverage on the ground. But I think the important point here really is that this is only going to deal an aspect of burglary in terms of bail, and it's not going to deal with the bigger problems. Now, Minister, when you published the bill, it was stated that one of the reasons for this was the importance of the home, and that was why the government was pushing this. Well, I think that will be, in and of itself, a little bit of an insult to the people who don't have a home and who find it a little bit alarming that the government have a newfound interest in the home, considering thousands and hundreds of thousands of people are without a home and many children are homeless at the moment. If we're serious about dealing with bail, then we should be doing what the Penal Reform Trust bodies have said about this. And they say the most effective way to improve compliance with bail conditions, particularly where the accused person has a chaotic life and complex personal challenges, lies in the provision of bail supports and services that allow the accused to remain within their community and address offending-related behaviour in a familiar environment. So that's what the experts think. If we really wanted to have an impact on behaviour and deal with bail properly, that's what we'd be doing. We're dealing here with bail in terms of burglars, and as I said, that's a bad crime. It should be dealt with, but it's not the worst crime. More than 100 people have been murdered or killed by offenders out on bail for other crimes in the past 10 years. That's a fact. This bail bill that we have before us will not address that situation. Horrendous cases like Sylvia Roach-Kelly, whose case reached the public domain, murdered by a man who was out on bail for 2 other crimes at the time. Gerald Barry, out on bail when he murdered a young Swiss student out walking in Galway in 2007. He was then 29 years old and had been charged with assaulting his girlfriend and was waiting to go on trial. Thomas Murray, a convicted murderer who was allowed back into the community, not by the courts, actually by the prison service. And despite the fact that the Gardaí had specifically said that this man should not be released into the community because he was a danger, he was released. The day he was released, he went out and murdered his former school teacher, Nancy Nolan, who lived in Galway. Daniel Martin, a troubled young man, again with a propensity to violence, who himself, while awaiting trial, he was the one who asked for his bail to be revoked because he couldn't deal with these anger issues. Now, these are real challenges to our bail system that this government had an opportunity to discuss here today, and you've chosen to ignore it instead of looking for a nice, juicy, kind of sexy headline that this government is going to somehow deal with burglars, when in reality you're cutting resources to deal with that. If we were serious in dealing with the victims of crime and criminal behaviour, why aren't we dealing with the bail scenario that resulted in the case of the horrific death of Shane O'Farrell, that I know you're well familiar with, in 2011? When we know that Shane was killed by a Lithuanian national, unfortunately I can't pronounce his name, but a man who had 40 previous convictions in 3 different jurisdictions and was out on bail. He was supposed to be signing into a Garda station daily. No one even noticed. That was in a couple of counties he was supposed to be doing that.
Talk about what's in the bill.
It is about.
It's not in the bill.
It's about bail, Count Corla, and this is about
bail
people.
in relation to burglaries. I appreciate the importance of what you're saying, but
well,
we have to stick to what's in the bill.
I would like the Minister then to bring an amendment to this bill to include bail for cases for dangerous drivers who get stopped with no tax, no insurance, no NCT, were taking heroin and end up mowing somebody down on the road, a young man at the prime of his life. Nothing in this bill as it stands, unless we amend it, is going to address that situation. And I think we also need to look at, when we're dealing with cases before the courts and whether the courts can decide to give bail or not, then the court needs accurate information in ascertaining that. We know in that case of Shane O'Farrell that the court weren't given evidence of previous convictions that the perpetrator had. The Gardaí didn't give that information to the courts, so the courts made the decision without that knowledge. And as a result, of course, we have the fact that GSOC are doing a public investigation inquiry where there's been 59 admissible complaints of a criminal character being investigated in this area, and yet one of the policemen involved in that has been promoted. One of the senior counsel who protected that person, last point, Count Corla, was appointed by yourself into the review of these crimes. So we need a balanced approach here when we're dealing with bail. We need consistency across the train, and we also need you to deal with the fact of what are the conditions that are giving rise to crime. Drug abuse, the lack of supports for people coming off, and difficult socio-economic circumstances that drive some people to commit burglary.